and welcome to our video summarising all you need to know about the European Union. My name is Barbara, and in this video we'll examine the European Union from its inception to its development, the ascension of lots of European countries, but also as it's developed, it's faced a wide range of Euroscepticism, and this has recently culminated in Brexit, which is the UK's exit, which is still ongoing from the European Union. So let's get started. So firstly, to begin with, the European Union was created by the Maastricht Treaty on the 1st of November 1993. It's essentially an economic and political union between 28 European countries that sets policies concerning the members' economies, societies, laws, and to some extent security. The European Union eliminates border controls between member countries, allowing for the largely free flow of goods and people. Taxes across the Union are standardised, meaning that products manufactured in any one member state can be sold to another member without tariffs and/or duties. The member states of the EU, and of course this will be changing soon, are Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Greece, Germany, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Netherlands, Portugal, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, and the UK as of July 2019. And the unique features of the EU is that although these are all sovereign, independent countries, they have pooled some of their sovereignty in order to gain strength and the benefits of size. Pooling sovereignty means in practice that the member states delegate some of the decision-making powers to the shared institutions that they've created so that decisions on specific matters of joint interest can be made democratically at a European level. Now, when it comes to the governance of the EU. So the EU is primarily run by the following institutions. On the one hand, we have the European Union Council, which consists of the heads of states or governments of the EU member states. The European Union Council defines the general political direction and the priorities of the EU. We also have the European Parliament. This represents the EU citizens and it's directly elected by them. The Parliament then adopts the laws. We also have the European Commission, which represents the interests of the EU as a whole, and it proposes new laws. Now, when it comes to decision making and legislation, the European Union is based on the rule of law. This means that every action taken by the EU is founded on treaties that have been approved voluntarily and democratically by all EU countries. The treaties are negotiated and agreed by the EU member states and then ratified by the parliaments and/or referendum. Treaty articles are referred to as the legal basis of the legislation, which determine the legislative procedure to be followed. The treaty sets out the decision-making processes, including Commission proposals, successive readings by the Council and Parliament, and the opinions of the advisory bodies. Now, there are different types of legislations. Firstly, you have regulation. This means a law that's applicable and binding in all member states directly. It doesn't need to be passed into national law by the member states. Secondly, we have the directive. This is a law that binds the member states or a group of member states to achieve a particular objective. Usually, directives must be transposed into national law to become effective. Thirdly, we have decision. This is addressed to member states or groups of people or individuals, and it's binding in its entirety. Fourthly, we have recommendations, and they have no legally binding force. And it's important to remember that the majority of EU legislation is adopted by using the ordinary legislative procedure, where the Parliament and Council share legislative power. Now, when it comes to economic coordination, all EU countries are part of the Economic and Monetary Union, the EMU, meaning that they coordinate their economic policy making and treat economic decisions as a matter of common concern. The coordination of sound public finances and structural policies is necessary for the EMU to function effectively and to ensure stability and growth. Now, when it comes to monetary policy, which deals with price stability and interest rates, it's managed independently by the European Central Bank in the euro area. For instance, those 17 countries which use the euro as their currency. Of course, this means that those that do not use it as a currency are excluded from this. When it comes to fiscal policy, which concerns decisions about taxation, spending and borrowing, this is the responsibility of the 27 member state governments. So are the policies about labour and welfare. The Council monitors member states' public finance and economic policies and make recommendations to individual EU countries based on proposals from the Commission. It may recommend adjustment measures and sanction euro area countries that don't take corrective measures to reduce excessive deficit and debt levels. Now, it's important to understand the different phases in the history of the European Union, but also European integration. So this really in earnest began in the 1940s and 50s, of course, after the Second World War. So let's start with the Council of Europe. This was founded in the aftermath of the Second World War, and it's Europe's oldest political organisation. The idea of convening a European Assembly first arose at the Congress of Europe, which was held in The Hague on the 10th of May 1948 by the International Committee of the Movements for European Unity. In the years immediately following the Second World War, many pro-European movements actively promoted the establishment of an organisation that would prevent a return to totalitarian regimes, in other words, dictatorships, and would also defend fundamental freedoms, peace and democracy. Participants adopting a political resolution called for the convening of a European Assembly and the drafting of a Charter of Human Rights. This, of course, led to the Schuman Declaration in 1950. It was presented by French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman. It entailed the creation of a European coal and steel community whose members would pool coal and steel production. The ESC, the founding members being France, West Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg, was the first of a series of supranational European institutions that would ultimately become today's European Union. This then led to the Treaty of Rome in 1957, which was signed by Belgium, France, the Federal Republic of Germany, Italy, Luxembourg and the Netherlands. This led to the establishment of the European Economic Community, EEC, creating a common market and customs union amongst its members. There was then a treaty that established the European Atomic Energy Agency for the purpose of developing peaceful applications of atomic energy, and it was signed by the same countries on the same day. We then have the de Gaulle Intergovernmental Approach and the Fouché Plan, which was between 1961 and 1962. This was a major diplomatic initiative by the French President Charles de Gaulle to alter the emerging institutions balance of the economic community away from the supranational model of the founding fathers in the 1950s and towards a looser intergovernmental approach based on cooperation among sovereign nation states. This union of states would parallel the existing European community in which a foreign policy and defence dimension would be added. This proposal was fiercely opposed initially, especially by Jean Monnet, the Dutch and the Belgians. Thus, the Fouché Plan failed. There was also the economic crisis of the 1970s, so Britain's economic performance was declining. Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath led Britain into the EEC in 1973. We then had the Single European Act in 1986, where 9 member states signed it, and it was followed later by Denmark, Italy and Greece. And this act extended the Union's power through the creation of large internal markets, the establishment of new powers with regards to monetary social policy, economic cohesion, research and technological development, the environment, and the cooperation of field of foreign policy. This also extended the Union's power through the growth in the role of the European Parliament. Also, this led to an improvement in decision-making capacity of the Council of Ministers through the introduction of a qualified majority voting. This replaced the unanimity in 4 of the community's existing areas of responsibility, including tariff, services, free movement of capital, and common sea and air transport policy. The unification of Germany from East versus West in 1989, of course this coincided with the end of the Cold War, paved the way for an unprecedented enlargement of the EU. Also, the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992 led to further European integration, and of course this is in the 80s and 90s. This formalised the concept of EU citizenship, allowing any individual from an EU nation to run for office in the government. This also led to the founding of the EU and the establishment of the pillar structure, which remained in place until the Lisbon Treaty of 2009. It also led to the creation of the single European currency, which is the euro, and this was renamed the European Economic Community to the European Community in order to reflect its expanded competencies beyond economic matters. There were also 2 new pillars created: the Common Foreign and Security Policy and cooperation in the field of justice and home affairs. The treaties of Amsterdam and Nice in 1997 and 2001 respectively were also important. So member states agreed to transfer certain powers from national governments to the European Parliament across diverse areas, including legislation on migration, civil and criminal laws, as well as implementing institutional changes for expansion of EU membership. The Treaty of Nice reformed the institutional structure of the European Union to withstand eastward expansion. Now, when it comes to the 1990s and 2000s, this really oversaw a period of integration and expansion into Eastern Europe. With the collapse of communism across Central and Eastern Europe, Europeans became closer neighbours. And of course, as mentioned before, in 1993, the single market completed the 4 freedoms of movement of goods, services, people and money. The 1990s was also the decade, of course, of the 2 treaties, the Maastricht Treaty on European Union in 1993 and the Treaty of Amsterdam in 1999. In 1995, the EU gained 3 more new members, which was Austria, Finland and Sweden, and a small village in Luxembourg gave its name Schengen to the agreements, which were called the Schengen Agreements, that gradually allowed people to travel without having the passport checked at the borders. This meant ultimately that millions of young people were able to study in other countries with the EU support. Communication was also made much easier as more people started using mobile phones and the internet. Now, there are several explanations for the European integration. So while some argue that European integration is a project aiming at rescuing the nation state, others claim that the main objective was to establish a union with supranational powers. However, the changing social perceptions, as much as political and economic realities, were responsible for the move towards the European Union. The rise of America to world preeminence following World War II served as a catalyst for European integration, and the electrifying impact and magnetic attraction of economic and political integration in Western Europe, which constituted a major stimulus for liberalization. Now, it's interesting to consider the idea of Europe. This idea was not an invention of the post-1945 era. Most of the great conquerors of Europe's long and bloody history, from the Romans to Charles V and from Napoleon to Hitler, have justified the quest as a way of bringing stability and order through unity. This idea of a Europe dominated by one hegemonic nation has thus been a constant feature of European history, but it has little in common with the 21st century understanding of economic and political integration. The idea of integration based on principles of democratic governance and common markets has been really new to post-1945 era. Its impressive appeal was based on a number of factors. The most obvious was that, in regard to national security, the West Europeans who championed integration viewed their countries as too weak to stand up against the real or imagined Soviet military threat. At the same time, most Western European politicians were not content with a simple abdication of power to American dominance and leadership during the Cold War. The answer, therefore, was to attempt to create strength through unity, even though this necessarily meant bringing together previously quarrelsome neighbours such as Germany and France. The modern idea of Europe is not, though, based simply on the need to confront an external enemy or the profitability of common markets, but also looks to the belief that there is a specific European identity. Since the 1940s, when the argument that Europeans share a common set of values that are rooted in ancient Greece and reach their maturity in the Enlightenment has gained a wide acceptance. The notion of common European identity is, however, quite controversial because many consider Christianity to be the cornerstone of the continent's value system. However, increased immigration from non-Christian parts of the world, as well as the debate over the potential accession of Turkey, a Muslim nation, into the EU, has naturally raised fundamental questions about this interpretation. The experiment that led the EEC and the EU was a fundamental commitment to liberal democracy and the rule of law. Now, when it comes to early prospects for European integration, in the aftermath of the Second World War, it was, however, issues of high politics rather than reflections on identity that led West European leaders to consider the necessity of integration, and 2 important factors emerged. So firstly, the tumultuous experience of the 2 world wars had shown clearly the catastrophic impact that national ambition and nationalist rivalries could have in the age of modern technology. Put simply, Europe had to take another, more peaceful course or risk destroying itself entirely. The second key factor was that the years of war brought about by a relative decline in Europe's influence. Europe's overseas empires were toppling. The colonized peoples in the European empires were demanding greater independence for France, Holland and Britain, which did not, in the long run, have the resources or the will to resist. As the prospect of decolonization threatened to translate into a dramatic reduction in the individual European countries' global power and influence, the temptation was to remedy this decline through pooling national resources through integration. Moreover, once this process began, it did have the effect of accelerating decolonization. However, more disturbing than the prospect of imperial decline was that even within their own continent, the individual European powers were relatively weak compared with the two superpowers, which was the USSR, the Soviet Union, and the USA. Therefore, pooling resources, both economic and military, appeared the only sensible way of redressing this new weakness. In short, integration was really the only way in which nations of Western Europe could avoid becoming mere pawns in the merging Cold War international system. This thus explains the key reasons for this shift from conflict to international cooperation in the period of post-1945. Now, of course, it's important to understand that there are key actors and obstacles within the EU. So firstly, one key actor when it comes to the United States of Europe is all the different countries involved in the EU. There were plenty of obstacles in the process of integration, for not every European nation had the same interest. Although the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill expressed his support for a United States of Europe in 1946, Britain rejected anything that went beyond establishing a free trade area. From early on, though, it was clear that the two key continental powers, France and Germany, preferred a much deeper form of cooperation that looked beyond the espousal of values to real economic and political integration. For both countries, integration was a means of enhancing prosperity and security, and thus aiding the massive task of reconstruction. Above all, however, they were faced with the knowledge that the national rivalry, which had contributed so significantly to the calamity of the world wars, could not be allowed to continue, and that it could only be tempered through mutually advantageous cooperation. Jean Monnet is another important figure. He was the former Deputy Secretary General of the League of Nations, who many consider to be the founding father of European integration, and he was a vital contributor to Europe's rehabilitation in the post-war years. And he concluded that economic integration was really the only way to avoid future conflict between France and Germany. One of the great ironies of European integration was that, in the immediate post-war period, it received a strong push from the US, a zealous champion of European integration, and the Marshall Plan was the primary instrument to encourage that goal. The Marshall Plan was guided by several interconnected objectives. On the one hand, it was seen as humanitarian, as it intended to provide a stimulus for the breaking down of tariff barriers within Europe. In June 1947, George C. Marshall pledged wholeheartedly to support European post-war reconstruction from the US. The Marshall Plan was, of course, also guided by economic and political self-interest, so without the economic growth in Europe, US exports would stagnate and likely decline. The Marshall Plan was also strategic. The onset of the Cold War provided a powerful incentive for the US to play a leading part in post-war economic affairs. This was essential for expanding the clout of Western liberal democracy in opposition to the Soviet Union's communist ideology. Although the Marshall Plan aided European recovery, it failed to break down national barriers to regional integration. For all their platitudes about integration, governments were unwilling to move beyond rhetorical support for supranationalism. Now, of course, there were lots of obstacles among European countries, as I've mentioned before. Instead of promoting European economic integration, many European states were preoccupied with their own economic survival. While Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands formed the Benelux Customs Union, which came into existence in 1948, France and Italy formed a partial Franco-Italian Customs Union in 1949. France mostly dominated the early years of European unity by directing the pace of the integration process according to its own interests. Accordingly, even after the foundation of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949, France initially maintained its occupation of the main German steel production area, the Saarland region, in order to deny Germany any chance of rearming. In 1950, the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman proposed an extraordinary idea to place the whole of Franco-German coal and steel production under a common high authority within the framework of an organization open to the participation of other countries of Europe. The pooling of coal and steel production should immediately provide for the setting up of common foundations for economic development as the first step in the Federation of Europe, and will change the destinies of these regions, which have long been devoted to the manufacture of munitions of war, of which they have been most constant victims. Thus, this neutralized French distrust and German resentment. This proposal was known as the Schuman Declaration. We also have the European Coal and Steel Community. The formation of the ECSC was the product of a combination of integrationist impulses and ideas, national self-interest, and international circumstances. Following the ECSC proposal, the French proposed the creation of a European defence community as a means of nullifying the threat posed by German rearmament. Ironically, although the treaty was negotiated and signed by the Six in 1952, the French National Assembly then refused to ratify it. Thus, an early opportunity to move towards a common European security policy was missed, and instead West German rearmament took place under the umbrella of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization Alliance. There was, of course, the empty chair crisis. So the collapse of the EDC resulted also in the collapse of the launch of an overarching political community. The political community was to have provided an organizational umbrella for the defense community and the ECSC. For many proponents of European federalism, the demise of the EDC and the political community was the greatest lost opportunity in the history of European integration. That some countries, particularly France, were bent on using the EEC to further their own nationalist agenda, rather than succumb to the loss of national sovereignty that true integration necessitated, cast an additional shadow over European integration in its first decades. France's president from 1958 to 1969, Charles de Gaulle, symbolized this tendency. He sought to use the EEC as a means of advancing French power. Eventually, his stubbornness led to the empty chair crisis of 1965 to 1966, during which France boycotted the meetings of the Council of Ministers, the highest body and executive arm of the EEC, for a 6-month period. De Gaulle's dominance of French politics not only prevented any rapid moves towards further integration, but also acted as an obstacle to EEC enlargement. The UK, of course, was also at times very much against the European Economic Community as well as the EU. And of course, ironically today, it kind of is. So in the early mid-1950s, with its empire and associated trade links still largely intact, Britain had been quite lukewarm about European integration. It recognised the latter's political potential for solving the German problem, but felt little need to become directly involved. However, by the late 1950s, with decolonisation underway in Southeast Asia, Middle East and Africa, Britain looked again to the idea of expanding its trade links with Europe. Now, there's lots of theoretical explanations when it comes to the EU and as well as the European Economic Community. Now, there are two grand theories that have historically been used to explain this European project: liberal intergovernmentalism and neo-functionalism. Liberal intergovernmentalists argue that the EU rescued the modern nation state, meaning states became more important thanks to European integration. In his book, The European Rescue of the Nation State, Alan Millward evaluated the emergence of the European community and the European integration process as an integral part of the post-war rescue of the European nation state. Alan Millward believed that after 1945, the European states needed a kind of European collaboration or coordination in order to rescue itself from collapse and survive, and eventually they needed the community as a protector against an ever stronger Germany, and he alleged that the European states will continue to need integration. On the other hand, neo-functionalism, which is the most elaborate theory of regional integration, has the strongest proposition based on its core concept of the spillover effect. This effect refers to a process of further integration which is created by the pressure in a policy area. Ben Rosamond explains the logic of spillover, giving a simple example. West European countries accomplished integration of coal and steel sectors, and they are required to integrate another cognate sector of the economy, which would be transport, since they needed to facilitate the movement of raw materials and products. Neo-functionalist theory argues that states that are cooperating under the community framework and agree to lose part of the sovereignty on an increasing range of issues, and whatever the level of integration, will undoubtedly be even greater in the future. Thus, the EU is considered to be an unfinished project, a work in progress. To date, neo-functionalism seems to have taken its course, with original economic integration giving rise to the integration of the social and political systems of the EU. Now, when it comes to the Lisbon Treaty, the Convention on the Future of Europe was created in 2002 to write an EU constitution. The draft, signed in 2004, aimed to install a permanent EU president, a foreign minister, and a Charter of Rights. It would have also allowed the EU to make many more decisions instead of the heads of the individual members. It was rejected in 2005 when France and the Netherlands failed to ratify it, and before other EU members got a chance to vote. An amended work, the Lisbon Treaty still aimed to install a EU president and foreign minister, as well as expand the EU's legal powers, but only through developing the existing bodies. This was signed in 2007, but initially rejected this time by voters in Ireland. However, in 2009, Irish protesters, or rather Irish voters, passed the treaty, many concerned about the economic effects of saying no. By the winter of 2009, all 27 EU states had ratified the process and it took effect. Herman Van Rompuy, at the time Belgian Prime Minister, became the first President of the European Council, and Britain's Baroness Catherine Ashton became High Representative for Foreign Affairs. There remain many political opposition parties and politicians in the ruling parties that oppose the treaty, and the EU remains a divisive issue in politics of all member nations. Now, when it comes to progress, the EU's trading structure has propelled it to become the world's second largest economy after China in terms of GDP as of 2017, based on data from the Central Intelligence Agency. In 2018, its GDP was worth 22 trillion, while China's was worth 25.3 trillion. These measurements use purchasing power parity to account for the discrepancy between each country's standard of living. The US was third, producing 20.5 trillion according to estimates by the International Monetary Fund. But the EU's success is not evenly distributed. Italy, Greece and Cyprus have high levels of public and private debt, including bad bank loans. Italy also has high unemployment, while France suffers from low productivity, and Germany has a large trade surplus. Of course, the topic on everybody's mind today when it comes to the EU is the impending breakup, known as Brexit, the EU's split from the UK, or rather the UK's decision to leave the EU. Now, on June the 23rd, 2016, the UK had a referendum in which it voted to leave the EU and become the first member state to use a previously untouched release clause. However, the terms of the exit still haven't been negotiated, which causes uncertainty, which has dampened business growth for companies based in the UK which operate in Europe. Now, when it comes to the causes of Brexit, there's a few reasons that caused it. Firstly, we have sovereignty. So many people in the UK, as in other EU nations, are worried about the free movement of immigrants and refugees. They don't like the budgetary constraints and regulations imposed by the EU, and they want their own respective countries to maintain a high level of sovereignty. Another reason is the immigration crisis. So in 2015, 1.2 million refugees from Africa and the Middle East poured through Europe's borders. On New Year's Eve in 2016, gangs of young refugees across Germany robbed, injured and sexually assaulted more than 1,200 people, primarily women. As a result, many EU countries sealed off their borders, leaving 8,000 immigrants stranded in Greece. Subsequently, the EU signed an agreement with Turkey to take back refugees who had reached Greece, and in return the EU would pay Turkey €6 billion. The influx of refugees caused political opposition towards Angela Merkel's party in Germany, and gentrification and social resentment in many other European countries towards the government. Immigration is one of the major reasons that contributed the UK to leaving the EU. We also have the Greek debt crisis. So the debt crisis of 2011 in Greece threatened the concept of the Eurozone itself. It potentially triggered several sovereign debt crises in Portugal, Italy, Ireland and Spain. EU leaders assured investors that it would stand behind its members' debts. At the same time, they imposed austerity measures to restrain the country's spending. They wanted all members to honour the debt limits imposed by the Maastricht Treaty requirements. There's also Euroscepticism on the rise. So after the Brexit vote, Populist parties across Europe have been stimulating the rise of Euroscepticism, particularly evident during the rhetoric of the French nationalist leader Marine Le Pen, who spoke of a Frexit. The Dutch far-right leader wanted a vote on Nexit. Matteo Salvini of Italy too raised the prospect of Italy leaving the EU. Czech Republic is also witnessing intense protests on this subject. So that's all. If you found this video useful, do give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel, but also don't forget that you can visit our website, which is www.firstratetutors.com, whereby we have lots of revision worksheets, lots of model answers that you can use, especially if you're studying this or many other topics across English, history and other major topics which are related to school and university. Thank you so much for listening.